From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome to The Sculptor's Funeral. I am your host, Jason Arkles, podcasting from Florence, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. Now, in the last episode, we were introduced to Lorenzo Giberti, the 20-year-old painter's assistant who became the unlikely winner of the competition for the doors of the Florence Baptistry, beating out competitors with much more experience, with his superior techniques in casting, his composition, and his aesthetics. Now, that achievement alone would be enough to earn Ghiberti a seat of honor in the pantheon of the early Renaissance. But in fact, Ghiberti's victory in the competition and the bronze doors which took him the next 2 decades to create, those were only a prelude to the outstanding masterpiece of his second set of doors. Doors which Michelangelo reportedly described as the Gates of Paradise. Now, we'll get to the Gates of Paradise eventually, but before we do, we should understand a little more about Lorenzo Giberti the man and the events leading up to his second set of baptistry doors. Now, out of context, the Gates of Paradise can seem like some sort of aesthetic quantum leap into the Renaissance from a much more primitive aesthetic, which we see in Ghiberti's first set of doors and in the works of other Florentines at the time. But when we stop and examine the particulars of Ghiberti's workshop and the associations, collaborations, and rivalries in which Ghiberti was entangled, as well as the innovations and research happening both in Ghiberti's studio and outside his studio, we can understand that the Gates of Paradise are a natural, perhaps inevitable result. So let's go back to the year 1403, when Ghiberti was finally declared the winner, beating out his rival Filippo Brunelleschi. Now, the devastated Brunelleschi apparently left Florence for Rome after the competition, turning his attention to antique sculpture and architecture to drown his sorrows. And he left Florence in the company of his younger friend, Donatello. Now, as for Ghiberti, one would think that he had it made, with the commission of a lifetime ahead of him. But there were some issues which still had to be resolved first. You see, as great as Ghiberti's competition panel was, Ghiberti himself was still a very young guy in his early 20s, and as far as we can tell, the competition panel was his first work in cast metal. Remember, he was a painter's assistant. Now, there can be little doubt that Lorenzo Giberti had help, and this help must have come from his father, Bartolo di Michele, also known as Bartoluccio. Now, if you recall from the last episode, when talking about Ghiberti and his biography, Giorgio Vasari refers to Lorenzo Giberti as Lorenzo di Bartoluccio. Actually, it seems pretty likely that Bartoluccio was in fact Lorenzo's stepfather. There's this whole paternity side story that pops up in Lorenzo Giberti's biography, which sometimes caused trouble for Lorenzo, and it's from Lorenzo's probable biological father that he gets the name Ghiberti. But anyway, that doesn't really need to concern us here. Stepfather Bartoluccio was in fact a goldsmith and a member of the Goldsmiths' Guild in good standing. Now, why Bartoluccio himself didn't compete for the doors really isn't known, but perhaps he recognized a superior talent in modeling in his stepson Lorenzo, and thought from the outset that Lorenzo just had a better chance of winning. Anyway, the guild, sponsoring the construction of the doors, the Arte di Calimala, needed a guarantee that they didn't just sign over a huge contract to someone who would eventually prove himself unequal to the task. So a contract was drawn up that named both Lorenzo and Bartoluccio as a team, jointly liable for the production of the doors. Kind of like when your dad co-signs a loan for your first car. Now, the contract had some interesting stipulations. One was that all the important parts of the relief had to be from Lorenzo Ghiberti's own hand. The Arte di Calimala wanted to ensure that the doors were as high quality as the competition panel was, so he wasn't allowed to have assistants doing any of the significant modeling. Another stipulation was that the work was to be done in about 10 years' time, and that the panels had to be churned out at a rate of about 3 panels per year. Spoiler alert, it took over twice that time to get the panels done. And by the way, the theme of the doors by this point had changed. Remember in the last episode when I said that the competition panel had the theme of Abraham and Isaac from the Old Testament, and that the Arte di Calamala thought that they could use the winning panel as one of the panels for the doors, whose theme generally was the Old Testament. Well, that got changed. They changed their minds. It was decided that the life of Christ would be a more fitting theme for these main doors facing the cathedral on the baptistry. But the Guild kept Ghiberti's competition panel anyway, and actually even had it gilt, possibly with the intention of it being placed on the third set of doors that the Guild planned to eventually commission. Now, a final stipulation in the contract with Lorenzo Giberti and his stepfather that I want to point out was that Lorenzo and stepdad would receive a salary, while all the materials and other expenses for the doors would be covered out of the Guild's own pocket. Most importantly, this included the expenses of paying for assistants. Now, this was highly unusual. Now, usually, if a goldsmith for a project wanted help in the form of hiring assistants, he had to pay for them out of his own pocket. So this effectively meant that Lorenzo Giberti didn't have to skimp on hiring assistants. And Ghiberti's list of assistants on the panels for the 20 or so years that it took to complete them, well, that list reads like a who's who of the early Renaissance Florentine goldsmiths. One of the first workers that Ghiberti hired was the young Donatello, in his late teens at this point, but someone in whom many people recognized an immense talent. As I mentioned, Donatello apparently went to Rome with Filippo Brunelleschi, his friend, his mentor in modeling and goldsmithing, and some say his lover. But either Donatello didn't go to Rome at this point, because actually no one knows for sure, or Donatello had returned to Florence within a year and begun working with Ghiberti. As for Brunelleschi, we can imagine that seeing his pal Donatello leave his side to go to work for Ghiberti, the man who had bested him in the competition for the doors, well, that might have been one of the many points of contention which kept Ghiberti and Brunelleschi at each other's throats throughout their lives. Other artists who worked for Ghiberti during the construction of those first doors include a very young Paolo Uccello, who in Ghiberti's shop started out as a 10-year-old shop boy, but would later become famous and influential as a practitioner of perspective in painting. Then there's Michelozzo, who would later become an influential architect and frequent collaborator with Donatello on various monuments. And there's also the possibility that the list of Ghiberti's assistants included Luca della Robbia and Masolino, but both of those claims are disputed. And, of course, there were dozens more who worked on these doors, whose names are much less familiar to us today. Now, even with this very generous contract, which awarded Ghiberti 200 florins a year, an outstanding annual salary for a goldsmith, and even with all the assistance he needed, work on this set of doors was a bit slow at first. However, enough progress was made and the initial work was seen as good enough that the Arte di Calamala, the Guild, drew up a revised contract in 1407, just 3 years into the project. Now, it was recognized in this new contract that work was going very slow, and so new stipulations were added to force Ghiberti to be more efficient in the running of his workshop and the budgeting of his time. So instead of a guarantee of 200 florins per year, Ghiberti in the new contract agreed to work, quote, every working day, all day long, with his own hands, like any journeyman, and that any interruption or pause in the day's work was to be recorded in a book kept for that very purpose. And so deductions would be made to his salary according to his work hours. Also, Ghiberti had to agree not to take on any other work outside of the doors without the Guild's permission. However, this new contract had a few bonuses for Ghiberti. The contract was made out to Ghiberti alone, without his stepfather acting as a co-signer, and that meant that the 200 florins a year went to Ghiberti alone, instead of having to share with his stepfather. His stepfather, meanwhile, was hired as an assistant, with the Guild paying his salary like any other assistant. So it was basically a raise for Ghiberti. The Guild apparently was very happy with what they had seen from Ghiberti's workshop so far, but he just had to work a little harder, a little faster. Now, judging by the fairly meticulous receipts kept by the Guild, who was paying for the project, of course. Most of the heavy work seems to have been completed by around 1415. And at this point, Ghiberti was evidently allowed to take on other work in his shop alongside the completion of the doors. As for the finishing of the doors, it took another 9 years to complete the finishing of the casts and the door frame and the gilding and the assembly. Just the gilding and the assembly of the doors seems to have taken an entire year. So when the doors were finally done, in April of 1424, the total cost was over 16,000 florins, or in today's money, about 2.5 million American dollars. The doors had taken 34,000 pounds of bronze to create. And what's more, it had taken half of its creator's life to finish. Lorenzo was 23 when he won the baptistry commission, and when the doors were finally hung, he was 45 years old. Now let's take a look at the doors themselves. Now, as always, you can check out the images at the image gallery for this episode, episode 39, at thesculptorsfuneral.com. Now, the first thing to note about these doors is that they were designed to be a match for Andrea Pisano's earlier doors, right? Built nearly a century before, in the 1330s. Like Andrea Pisano's doors, Ghiberti's doors consist of 28 panels, each with a quatrefoil frame. The top 20 panels depict the life of Christ, which was, of course, the theme for the door, and the bottom 8 panels depict the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the 4 doctors of the church. Church doctors were basically the early fathers of the organized Christian church, people like St. Jerome, who originally translated the early Bible into Latin, and St. Augustine, who was a hugely influential Christian philosopher and scholar. Now, it's not known which panels of these 28 panels were done first and which one was done last. They probably weren't done, in order, chronologically through the life of Christ, but historians have detected a general evolution of style within these panels. Now remember, this door took years and years and years and years, so it would actually be very surprising to see a completely unified and constant style across all these panels. Although, of course, Ghiberti would have certainly tried for as much cohesion and unity as possible from one panel to the next. Weirdly, one of the most reliable ways we have of dating the individual panels, in terms of which he did first and which he did next, the most reliable way we have is by examining the work of painters who borrowed, or shall we say stole, different details and compositions and motifs from these panels for use in their own painting. We need to keep in mind that these reliefs were in Ghiberti's shop in one form or another, first in wax and then in bronze, but they hung around in his shop for years before they were ever mounted on the baptistry. And so any painter who wanted to could paint a picture based on Ghiberti's excellent designs, and then finish that painting years before Ghiberti's work became public. And by examining the chronologies of these unscrupulous painters and their works, a general chronology can be established, and it would seem that almost everything was cast and modeled between 1408 and 1419. An example of Ghiberti's early work on the doors might be the panel illustrating the birth of Christ, known as the Nativity. It is, in fact, reminiscent of Ghiberti's original competition panel, right? You've got sort of an off-center focal point of the Virgin and the Child, and then you've got shepherds off to one side who are evidently reacting to the scene in the center. And we see the division of the panel into separate areas by rather convenient rock formations. We even see that the heraldic angel seems to be almost a quote from the original competition panel's angel. And really, that makes sense, right? I mean, Ghiberti won the competition with these motifs and these compositional effects, so why mess with success? But even Ghiberti's weaknesses are replicated here in the Nativity. The figures have a definite Gothic air to them, right, in proportion and pose, and the drapery is competent but formulaic. But even this is a testament to the strength of Ghiberti's personal style. I mean, he could have easily capitalized on the naturalism and originality that Brunelleschi demonstrated in his competition panel, And, Ghiberti could have borrowed and emulated Brunelleschi's advances, but Ghiberti's personal style was rooted in the late Italian Gothic, which over time became influenced by the Gothic International style. And what was the Gothic International style of art? How was that different from just regular Gothic? Well, Gothic International was a period of art kind of sandwiched in between and overlapping the late Gothic and the early Renaissance styles. It started in France, but very quickly spread all over Europe, as its name implies, right? It's international. Now, it's most helpful, I think, to regard the international style as a refined Gothic style, right? In international Gothic, figures are elegant and elongated. Emphasis is placed on graceful, curvilinear lines, whether that's in drapery or in the poses of the figures themselves. These nice swooping curves. We talk about the Gothic swoop sometimes. Now, late Gothic sculpture, on the other hand, is a little bit more idiosyncratic, right? It's more variable because the aesthetic of Gothic sculpture, of late Gothic sculpture, really had more to do with the skills and training of the particular artist creating it, right? Rather than having a style imposed upon it in the way the International Gothic style did. And so at some point in the middle process of the modeling of the doors for the baptistry, Ghiberti's work starts to show the influence of this International Gothic style, which started to seep into Florence in the first decade of the 15th century. Ghiberti's drapery becomes more consciously designed, with heavier folds that give elegance to the figures and elegance to the larger composition. Now, such a panel reflecting this in Ghiberti's doors is the panel known as Christ Among the Doctors, which is a tour de force of international-style drapery design. But it's also evident in the Baptism of Christ and in the Temptation panels as well. Now, this influence of the International Gothic style takes a hold of Ghiberti, and it seems to stay with him for the rest of his career. Now, the high point of Ghiberti's exploration of the International Gothic style comes in the form of a full-size statue in bronze, which he was commissioned for in 1414. Now, his bosses, the guild, the Arte di Calamala, had made Ghiberti agree not to take on any extra work without their permission. But by 1414, work was satisfactory enough and going at a nice enough pace that the guild itself decided to commission this other work from Ghiberti, alongside the doors he was already doing for them. And this was to be a statue of John the Baptist, and created in bronze and mounted onto the facade of the Oratorio of Orsan Michele. Now, this is a hugely important piece of sculpture, this John the Baptist, hugely important for the history of Renaissance sculpture. And I will thoroughly cover it in the upcoming podcast about Orsan Michele, but it's just worth mentioning here. And as I mentioned, it's the epitome of Ghiberti's international style of sculpture. So back to the doors. What was the reaction to this fantastic set of doors after its completion in 1424, right? This largest, most prominent, prestigious, and expensive piece of art commissioned in living memory, created by a man whose skills and talent had already given him the reputation of the most eminent sculptor in Italy. What was the reaction? Well, that's kind of a tricky question. Although it was celebrated as being a worthy counterpoint to the doors of Andrea Pisano, and nobody doubted the genius and skill of Ghiberti, at the same time, the doors were seen as a bit of an anachronism. Right? It had taken more than 2 decades to complete these doors, but in that span of 20 years, Florence had moved on. Artistically, Ghiberti's doors were old news as soon as they were installed. And we'll discuss just what changed so much in the first 20 years of the 1400s that made Ghiberti's doors artistically obsolete when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey, podcast listeners. The Sculptor's Funeral is made possible by your generous donations, as well as by our sponsor, Blick Art Supplies. That's right, friends. Blick Art Supplies, the largest and oldest provider of art supplies in the United States, shipping their quality wares around the world. Their superior customer service, extensive selection, and competitive prices make them the choice for professional and amateur artists, art educators, architects, designers, students, and hobbyists. Virtually anyone requiring quality art materials for work or for pleasure. And seriously, there isn't another art supplier on the web with as many supplies and materials specifically for sculptors than Blick. It's really huge. They have over 70,000 products for artists of all types. You can get everything you need, from dozens of different clays and plasters to fine Italian marble carving tools, clay modeling tools, specialty casting mediums, body casting supplies, turntables, armatures, books on sculpture, you name it. If you need it for sculpture, they got it. And shipping is free in the U.S. for most items if your order is over $100. But Blick is not merely a place to buy stuff. Their sales staff and product information specialists are trained to hunt down answers to your tough questions regarding materials, techniques, and safety. Hundreds of Blick videos are also available at dickblick.com and on YouTube, including video lesson plans for teachers and product demonstrations for artists. And best of all, by buying your art supplies from Blick, you contribute directly to the support of the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. All you need to do is this. Go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and click on any of the banner links that you see there. And that will take you right to the Blick website where you can buy whatever you need. It's that simple. Just remember that you need to click through a link on thesculptorsfuneral.com first so that Blick knows I sent you. So the next time you stock up on armature wire, mold rubber, modeling tools, and plastilina, do it in a way that supports the only podcast out there devoted to the global community of figurative sculpture. Go to thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on Blick and support the show. Thanks. Welcome back. So I mentioned before the break that the triumph of Ghiberti's doors, begun in 1403, was seen as a bit outdated by the time they were installed in 1424. Although his personal style had evolved somewhat from his original competition panel, it went in the direction of the international Gothic style, which was new on the scene in Florence, but was also a short-lived movement in Florence, due to the sudden rise of a new style in the hands of several artists, which today we recognize as early Florentine Renaissance style. The sculptors Donatello and Nanni da Banco, the painters Masaccio and Masolino, and others were forging ahead with a new mode of art making, drawing upon influences from Greco-Roman traditions, advances in pictorial theory and the science of optics, an awakening to the observation of nature, new developments in technical processes, and much more. And all this created a mode of art wholly distinct from everything that had come before. Now, I mentioned some of these breakthroughs that were heralded at this time by Donatello, and I mentioned it in the Donatello podcast, which is episode number 2. So for a fuller story about these advances, go ahead and listen to that episode, as well as the upcoming episode on the Oratorio of Or San Michele, which will go into greater detail about these advances in sculpture at the time. But one factor of early Renaissance sculpture we really need to address here explicitly in our discussion of Ghiberti is the advent of linear perspective. Now, we all know what is meant by that, right? Linear perspective. We know it's the specific formula of draftsmanship that allows a painter to render a scene which contains a convincing illusion of depth. Now, this illusion is created by rendering the scene as though it were being viewed by an eye within that pictorial space. And so the viewer of the painting sees from that perspective. Florentine artists had really been interested in how to do this correctly for a long time, and many artists had greater or lesser success with it, but it wasn't until a few key circumstances all lined themselves up in Florence that linear perspective was finally cracked. And this momentous advance happened while Ghiberti was artistically sequestered to his studio, chugging away at his doors. He was in the middle of all the action, but he was unable to incorporate the new perspective into his Gothic composition already underway. So, how was this problem of perspective solved? Well, the easy answer is that Filippo Brunelleschi did it. But if you want to know how, or even when, That answer gets a lot more vague. See, one of the enduring mysteries of the Renaissance is just what Brunelleschi was up to between the time of the baptistry competition in 1403 and his being assigned the job of designing the cupola, or dome, for the Duomo all the way in 1417. We don't know really what he was doing at that time. We know that he went to Rome at least once and probably several times during this period. We have records that show he sat on a few part-time advisory committees in connection with the ongoing construction of the Duomo, but that wouldn't have taken him much time or effort. And we also know that at a couple different points he was involved with sculptural commissions, but he probably only designed the sculpture for another sculptor to carve. And with the other, he actually backed out of the contract before work began and was nearly thrown in jail because of it. But from 1403 to 1417, there's just no official documentation of Brunelleschi in connection with commissions for the guilds or for anyone else. Now, he was from a well-off family, and so he could afford not to work. But what was he doing with his time? The official records of any artistic projects are very, very scant. But that's the official record. But Brunelleschi appears again and again in anecdotes and third-hand accounts of the time, and when we piece all these anecdotes together, we get sort of a picture of a young man entering his prime, occupied with personal exploration and experimentation. And by the time Brunelleschi re-enters the official records, we find that he is a man with a reputation for originality and genius. We find that he's no longer a goldsmith. He's now an architect, somehow. And we find that he is considered by all to be the father of linear perspective. There is little that tells us how he managed all this, but there's plenty to tell us that people took notice all along the way. By 1413, we find in one piece of writing that Brunelleschi is referred to as the perspective expert. We read in other writings, written much later, that Brunelleschi conducted painted experiments with linear perspective, demonstrating the primary importance of having a fixed point of observation when viewing a form in perspective, and demonstrating the scientific formulas behind replicating such a fixed point in painted work. The first physical evidence, though, of his pursuit of perspective comes not from his own hand, but from the hand of his good friend and collaborator, Donatello. There's a small relief carved in marble at the base of the figure of St. George that Donatello carved for Or San Michele, done around 1415, maybe 1416. And this work clearly shows a perspected checkerboard floor, a colonnade that recedes into the perspective distance, and other features of perspective, which Donatello could only have completed by knowing about the advances his friend Brunelleschi pursued. And Brunelleschi's theories on linear perspective made the painter Masaccio famous when Masaccio applied the formula to his painting in the Brancacci Chapel just a few years later in 1424. Now, I could go on and on about Brunelleschi's probable influences and studies which led him to this point, and maybe I will in a future podcast. I do actually get into it a bit in episode 3, which is the episode about Leon Battista Alberti, who was the author of a book called De Pittura, which is kind of an artist's handbook written in the 1430s, which spells out Brunelleschi's theories on perspective. Alberti's book is even dedicated to Brunelleschi. But for now, let's bring Brunelleschi's rival, Lorenzo Giberti, back into the story. Now, just imagine it from Ghiberti's perspective. His friend, Donatello, who just a few years before was one of Ghiberti's own employees, is now gaining instant fame with his St. George relief and its paradigm-shifting use of perspective. Meanwhile, Ghiberti, locked into the need to stay unified with his composition for his doors, plods on in the older style for another 9 years. Ghiberti's opportunities to work in the new style with the new techniques were slipping away from him. However, Ghiberti did find ways to dip his hands into more contemporary fashions. In that first set of doors, we do see that the early influence of the Greeks and Romans that he showed in his competition panel, it shows up again. but this time in the design of a series of small portrait heads that he made, which sort of decorate the frames of the doors. Now, these frames for the doors, for the panels, would have been the last things to be modeled for the doors, done after the completion of the panels themselves. So some historians say that a few of these heads, these portrait heads, show so much influence of the antique, and actually influence of particular portraits known to have been in Rome at the time, that it seems likely Ghiberti himself must at some point have made a pilgrimage to Rome. Ghiberti had another opportunity to sort of explore newer styles and different influences in the form of a commission from another guild to sculpt another bronze statue for another niche at Orsan Michele, and this one was of St. Matthew. It's far and away the most progressive, shall we say, Renaissance-ish statue that Ghiberti produced in his lifetime, this St. Matthew. But it still doesn't rise to the originality of even Donatello's very early St. Mark, also on Orsan Michele. But finally, the doors were complete, and Ghiberti, with the reputation of being the most accomplished, if not the most progressive artist in Florence, was now free to do as he pleased. And almost immediately, the Arte di Calamala commissioned another set of doors from him. Now, these would be the third and final set of doors for the baptistry. And we know what I'm talking about. These are the so-called Gates of Paradise. And we know that it took Ghiberti 27 years to finish these doors. But this wasn't to be merely a repeat of the last commission. No, now that he had proved himself with the first set of doors, Ghiberti was given a lot more freedom. For one thing, he was no longer beholden to replicate the style of Andrea Pisano's doors, designed a century before. The contract for this new and final set of doors stated that Ghiberti could handle the theme, that of the Old Testament, in any manner he pleased. And I should point out that at this time there was no competition to see which sculptor was most suited to do the job. There was only one Lorenzo Giberti. Now, 27 years is a long time to spend making a set of doors. And in fact, it took much less time than that, due to several delays and setbacks, which included, an outbreak of plague, a war with Milan, and an economic downturn. Actual work on the doors didn't start for 5 years, until about 1429. And records indicate that all the panels were largely modeled and cast by 1437, so that's a period of just 8 years. But it still took another 15 years to add to these panels a ton of figures that would be separately cast and then sort of soldered on, and also to finish the door frame and the chasing and the assembly and the gilding. It took another 15 years. So despite the delays which dogged the first set of doors at the beginning, Ghiberti was very active in that early period. He created his third and last statue for Orsan Michele, his St. Stephen. He produced reliefs for the baptistry of Siena, and he did a couple other things. What really should be mentioned is a very strange sort of episode in Ghiberti's career. Now, most people know that it was Brunelleschi who designed and built the cupola over the Florence Duomo. But the commission was actually awarded to Brunelleschi and Ghiberti both. Now, this doubtless has everything to do with Ghiberti's reputation of eminence among Florentine artists, and of course, this only added tremendous fuel to the fire of professional jealousy in Brunelleschi. And the fact is, Ghiberti really had no business participating in the construction of the cupola. I mean, not only did he have no business in it, he didn't know what he was doing, really. He also had little interest in the construction process, apart from his interest in making sure that everyone knew that he was officially the co-architect, even if the design and construction oversight was entirely in the hands of Brunelleschi. Now, Ghiberti's role in the Duomo, in the cupola, was a little more than ceremonial, right? Even calling it advisory would be an exaggeration of Ghiberti's expertise in this area, and a slight to Brunelleschi's genius. But this is not to say that Ghiberti's status was unwarranted. And now, in the third set of doors, Ghiberti was in the perfect position to prove his own genius. He was unfettered by the constraints which held him in check on his first doors, and Ghiberti created, one almost might say unleashed, a work of art in Florence that serves as a threshold not solely into paradise, but a threshold into which the Florentine Renaissance proceeded, closing the door on the artistic paradigms of the previous 1,000 years. So, in Ghiberti's last set of doors, we find the fruits of a lifetime invested in the exploration of sculpture, given free rein in terms of time, money, and artistic control. The first thing we notice when we look at the Gates of Paradise is how different they are to Ghiberti's first set of doors. Now, instead of 28 panels encased in big, heavy frames, we find only 10 panels, with the frames surrounding each panel much more streamlined and thin. This means that each scene rendered has a much larger playing field. Looking at the panels from the old set to the new set of doors, it's like going from watching a movie on your laptop to seeing one on the big screen. These 10 panels are positively panoramic in comparison with the earlier doors. And accordingly, in each panel, we find that the larger pictorial field has been put to use in rendering a much more sweeping landscape than was possible in those smaller panels. Instead of each panel dominated by a few figures, and the figures' environments like mountains or architecture playing quite literally a background role, here we find in Ghiberti's final set of doors, each panel is dominated by space. Outdoor space, fields or mountains or cities. Architectural space, architectural settings like civic forums and vast colonnades, triumphal arches and flights of steps. And the figures represented in these spaces really reside within these spaces, right? They fit into the landscape, properly perspected in terms of relation to space around them and their distance from the frontal plane. Even the panels which contain more than 50 figures are dominated by architecture or mountains rather than crowds of people. These 10 panels are a collection of landscapes. Now, fitting figures and objects in scale into a relief like this is actually a lot harder than it sounds. So when attempting the illusion of depth, either in a painting or a relief, now it's easy to depict that depth with architecture, right? Using linear perspective with a vanishing point. But when the setting is a landscape with little or no architecture, it's not so cut and dry. Figures depicted as far away necessarily must be rendered smaller, but it must be done following the laws of linear perspective, or else the relation of foreground and background figures won't work. It's a very precise formula. The background figures have to be precisely smaller in scale in relation to the perceived depth. Ghiberti is pretty successful at that in these relief panels, but not all the time. Still, he is employing revolutionary principles as developed by Brunelleschi just in the last decade, so it's still a pretty good job. And it's one of the earliest examples known, and it's certainly the most complex example of perspective at the time. Out of the 10 panels, 3 are dominated by architecture, and the rest are sort of scenes of landscapes, mountains and fields and that sort of thing. And the 3 panels of architecture are probably the most famous and well-known. The panel depicting the story of Joseph might be the most recognizable. It's a perspective tour de force in which is depicted a colonnaded rotunda, right? A circular building but seen in perspective. It's probably the most complex structure to be rendered in perspective in history, probably, up to that point. But it's probably the Jacob and Esau panel that most people find to be his masterpiece, the most beautiful, with the perfect balance between architecture and figures, very clear composition, lively and varied modeling in the figures, and these figures assume poses that are as novel as they are natural. Now, with these panels, like in the previous set of doors, we don't have a complete chronology as to which were made at what time. Although we do know that the first panel modeled was, in fact, the Adam and Eve panel, which is the beginning of the story. It's the top left panel on the door. And we can see in the Adam and Eve panel that Ghiberti is still sort of grounded in the international Gothic style. His work does mature and progress towards a more Renaissance-y flavor, but The Adam and Eve panel might be regarded as a transitional panel from the International style into the early Renaissance style. Note in the Adam and Eve panel the rather Gothic figures of God and Eve, the sweeping drapery that we associate with Ghiberti's first set of doors. It's all there. Not to mention the less than convincing pictorial space rendered in less than perfect perspective. But you may notice, as you look at the Adam and Eve panel, that there are actually 4 sets of Adams and Eves, all within this same space. The entire story, from the creation of Adam to the creation of Eve, the temptation, and then finally the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, all happen in this same one pictorial space. And each little group of figures is performing a different part of the story. Now, this is sometimes called continuous narrative or polychronic depiction. It's a very old painter's technique. It goes back to ancient Rome, and was still used sometimes in Gothic work, but hadn't been used for a couple generations in Florence, apparently, until it was revived and used by the painter Masaccio just a few years before Ghiberti modeled this Adam and Eve panel. Ghiberti uses this device in other panels as well. For instance, in the Jacob panel, Jacob appears no less than 7 times in the same scene to tell his complete story. First he's doing this, then he's doing that. And this is how these 10 panels on Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise actually portray almost 40 different scenes from the Old Testament. Masaccio's painting, which I mentioned as being one of these polychronic depictions, it's called The Money Changers, and it's part of a larger fresco cycle depicting the life of St. Peter. And it's in a chapel in Florence, and it was painted in the mid-1420s, just as Ghiberti was signing the contract for the second set of doors. Masaccio's frescoes and Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise have so much in common. Both were some of the earliest uses of linear perspective in painting and in sculpture. Both were at the forefront of compositional and pictorial theory, and both essentially inaugurated the early Renaissance pictorial style, which was to dominate Florentine painting and sculpture for the rest of the century. Now, one person who learned from and was influenced by these two works was Leon Battista Alberti, right? He was a bit of an amateur when it came to sculpture and painting, but he had a genius for explaining technique and process and theory. Now, in the same book in which he recorded Brunelleschi's advances in linear perspective, this book known as De Pittura, written in the 1430s, Alberti records his understanding of art theory as practiced by Florentines of the time. Now, Alberti says that the highest one could reach with a painting is the creation of an historia. An historia is a painting which contains specific types of content and done in a certain way. Effectively, an historia should convey emotion and drama, involving the use of many figures in a perspected setting, with a great deal of variation in color and action, and the poses of the figures should express that character's motivations and emotions. And it should above all be pleasing to the eye, the historia, and it should afford the viewer of such a work a good deal to enjoy and to reflect upon, all while remaining harmonious in composition. So according to Alberti, in essence, a good painting should have large, well-constructed spaces and full of a variety of people doing interesting things, right? I know that sounds pretty vague, and Alberti does go into greater detail, but for us, it's enough to know that Alberti wrote this after Masaccio's fresco cycle was painted and towards the end of the period when Ghiberti was modeling the Gates of Paradise. Now, the reason these works epitomize Alberti's theory of historia is because Alberti probably derived the theory from these works. And due to the influence of not only these works, but Alberti's writing, both Ghiberti's doors and Masaccio's frescoes were regarded by their contemporaries as near definitive statements on the subject of art, and were valuable teaching tools for the next several generations of Florentine artists who studied and copied these works as students. Such was the greatness of the Gates of Paradise that, when they were complete, the guild, the Arte di Calamala, took the surprising step of replacing Ghiberti's first set of doors, which depicted the life of Christ and stood in the main portal of the baptistry, which faces the cathedral. The guild replaced that set of doors with the new set of doors. So now the earlier doors, depicting the life of Christ, were relegated to the north side of the baptistry, and the new doors got to go center stage. Now that's not surprising at all from an aesthetic point of view, but from a theological point of view, replacing a work representing the life of Christ in such a significant position with scenes from the Old Testament, that doesn't seem very logical, theological. I mean, to have sheer beauty and artistry trump theology in this matter, well, that speaks to the tremendous impact the doors had and the reverence they must have inspired to everyone who saw them. So Ghiberti completed his third set of doors in 1452, more than 50 years after besting his lifelong rival Brunelleschi in the competition of 1401. Brunelleschi never lived to see Ghiberti's masterpiece finished. Brunelleschi died in 1446. As for Ghiberti, by then in his 70s, but still active, the Arte di Calamala, after the completion of the second set of doors, determined to make the most out of their lifelong relationship with Ghiberti, and they commissioned Ghiberti, along with his son, who had grown up working in his father's employ, to create a decorative door frame for Andrea Pisano's set of doors on the baptistry, the Gothic Doors, which, before Ghiberti came along, were regarded as Florence's masterpiece. Ghiberti died in 1455, and this door frame was finished by his son. And so it came to pass that Lorenzo Giberti, who begun his career with the emulation of Andrea Pisano's 14th century masterpiece, would end his career by both figuratively and literally reframing the art of relief sculpture for the 15th century. I want to thank you all for listening. Okay, so I think that's all I'm going to say about doors for quite a while. The last 3 episodes have all been about doors. We'll move on. Now don't forget, you can join in the conversation at our Facebook group page for the Sculptor's Funeral. You can ask a question there or leave a comment for me or for others. You can leave sculpture-related posts or you can just say hi. You can also subscribe to the podcast at Stitcher Mobile or iTunes, or subscribe from any service from which you get your podcasts, and receive the Sculptor's Funeral automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device every week. And hey, if you do go to iTunes, why don't you give the podcast a rating, right? You can, click on how many stars you think I deserve for this stuff. And you can even leave a line or two commenting on the podcast if you like. You can check out the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, where you can stream the entire archives of the show without having to subscribe to anything, and you can do it all for free. Check out the image galleries for this and for each episode, and if you are in the market for some art supplies, click on the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies. Doing so supports the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.